Hello, you're listening to Count Richard von Cooden of Killargy. Today is Sunday the 25th of May, and I just thought I'd put a couple of comments there together with a video. And today being quite a special day for me, as it is the 7th anniversary of me making my first video for Count Richard von Cooden of Killargy. Now, that pub in front of us there is called the Glenside, and they sometimes have traditional music sessions in there, I think Thursdays, and it's one of the pubs in Dublin with a lovely thatch roof. And but yeah, it's 7 years since I did my first video, and I suppose really apart from, I'd like to thank all my subscribers and those that have been very kind enough to comment under my videos, and I do really appreciate that. And who'd have thought that over 350 videos later I'd still be putting my thoughts together. I would also like to pay tribute to the likes of those like Peter Dooley and Val Martin, who are able to contribute videos daily. So the effort that they go into producing their material in the volume that they do is quite extraordinary. So well done them, and thank you for all those others who are fighting the good fight in the movement. Now on the left hand side here you have De La Salle School, and so I just thought what inspired me to actually start making my videos was the fact that on the 25th of May 2018 there were two things happened that day. One was the abortion referendum, and since then there has been in 2019 6,666 abortions. In 2020 it was 6,577. 2021 it was 4,577, and in 2023 was 10,033, and in the first 6 months of 2024, as the full figures haven't been released yet, it is 4,442. so there's no reason to believe that that won't go up near the 10,000 figure. And so effectively in 2022 that represented roughly 1 in 8 pregnancies ended in a termination, and which is roughly 12%, and in 2023 it is believed 1 in 6 pregnancies ended in abortion. And it's interesting to note that the HSE describes abortion as a common form of reproductive maintenance. Imagine that. And to be quite honest with you now, back when I was a young fella, I met a girl back in 1983 it was. She was only 24 years old, and at that stage she had 4 abortions. And isn't that a magnificent sunset? I have to say I love this time of the evening known as the golden hour, as everything just appears golden. So this is Bramer Road, and it has a lovely avenue of trees and cycle lanes in varying stages of decay, as a lot of them are now. Now the second reason that inspired me to open up my channel was the arrest of Tommy Robinson. Now I took an interest in him for a long time, and I did buy his copy of his book Muhammad's Quran, which I have to say was very interesting reading, talking about the actual Quran itself and how, unlike the Bible, it's not written in chronological order, but when it is compiled in chronological order it does make more sense. So I'd strongly recommend that as a read. But what really turned me off him was there was an incident in schools in Birmingham where the Muslims were protesting about sex education being brought into the schools, and he was against that. He said no, he says that people have to realise that the new modern families are going to have 2 men and 2 women as parents. And I thought to myself, you know what, I don't agree with you on that one. I said in regards to sex education, what you want to bring in schools, I think the Muslims are 100% correct in saying that they don't want this, and there's no place for this in schools at the levels that they want to teach it into children. Now this road here is I think it's Dodder Road, and these coppiced trees here are most beautiful when hit with direct sunlight. Unfortunately we're near the sunset But I think you get the picture of how beautiful they are. They look like mushrooms on sticks, garlic mushrooms at that, with creamy cheese in the middle would be my preference. But I suppose as well, as regards my name, Count Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi, the origins of that and why I chose that name relates back to a speech that was made by Nick Griffin when he was elected an MEP for the British National Party, and he made a speech in the 14th of March 2014 where he blasted the EU on its migration policies and said this was actually, that mass migration was going to be used to genocide the European people. So I suppose that was where I got I'd never heard of Kalergi before. I didn't know who he was, and that's what got me interested. So when I opened up an account with the Irish Independent, I used to go by the name of the Coudenhove-Kalergi Plan in the hope that that name would appeal to people's sense of the curious. Now this is the back road here of Rathfarnham Bridge. We just crossed over there, and you can see how much of the road is taken up by a bloody cycle lane. It's quite extraordinary. In fact, a couple of times now driving along this way at the bend, I've scuffed my tyres by, it is a very narrow margin, especially if you're meeting a large vehicle, a long truck or any, but it isn't, although I have to say there's an extraordinary amount of work done on it, and it does look nice, but it does take up a considerable amount of road. But so that got me onto discovering who Kalergi was, and his book, interestingly, this year is the 100th anniversary of his book Practical Idealism, which was written in 1925, and I suppose the famous quotes regarding race, his personal philosophy regarding race. But it's interesting, Kalergi was born in Tokyo in 1894. He was the son of an Austrian count, and his mother was the daughter of a Japanese shipping magnate. And I'm in two minds as to whether, personally I think he's one of the most evil men in history, but he's never discussed and never talked about. And as to whether his book Practical Idealism, about this whole effectively the erasure of the native citizens in their own countries through mass inward migration, and whether his book has actually been taken as a blueprint as EU policy. But he was part of the pan-European movement in the 1920s and was funded by the Warburg brothers to the tune, I think, 60 million German marks. And he was also involved in setting up the EU back in the early 1950s. And the Charlemagne Prize, he was the first recipient of the Charlemagne Prize in 1952, where other people who received that award have included Winston Churchill and Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and strange enough Pat Cox is in there somewhere, and the Euro, and the Pope. One year the Pope got it, and he died in 1973 at the age of 77, and he chose Ode to Joy, or suggested Ode to Joy as the European national anthem. Now, it took me ages to get a copy of Practical Idealism, and I got an English translation of it, which is published by Veritas. But one of the things I'm going to do later on is I'd actually like to do a video and put it in at the end of this of the introduction to the English translation of Kalergi's book, and to give you an idea of what the thinking of this man actually was. He was actually quite a prolific writer, and I would suspect that because of the nature of what's going on in Europe now, Practical Idealism would be one of his more famous books. Now, the other thing I suppose, interestingly, during the week to comment on the meeting between Trump and the South African president, as you can imagine, and as my subscribers would know, I've always had an interest in history, especially air combat. But could you imagine my shock and surprise to think that a country like South Africa now, that has a fleet of 330 aircraft, only 6 of them are actually flying. Imagine that. And if you consider the South African Air Force was formed on the 1st of February 1920 and took part in the Second World War, and interestingly they flew German aircraft as well as Allied, such as they had German Ju-86s, and Ju-52 Stukas, and they had 46 pilots were aces, including one of their pilots, a fellow called Beauchamp Proctor, if I'm doing justice to his name, shot down 54 aircraft. But I couldn't believe that, just to go to show what is actually going on in South Africa, and not only with the persecution of the white farmers, but it seems to be turning into a failed state. And I suppose if you think of the film The Wild Geese, there's a very interesting scene in The Wild Geese with Richard Harris, Richard Burton, where the white South African guy who is given the charge of taking care of the president of the country, who's played by an actor called Winston Nishona, if I pronounced that right. But I thought it was an interesting thing that ultimately, even though the whites make only 7.7% of the population of South Africa, the communities need to come together and cooperate with each other. Otherwise, it's just going to descend into absolute anarchy and a failed state. But could you imagine my surprise with seeing that figure, about 6 aircraft only service, which basically means South Africa is undefensible. But that was all. And just on another note, also, it's funny how words can come back to haunt you later on in life. In the previous part of my life, I have to say, I was a very heavy drinker, and at one stage I was on 6 bottles of vodka a week, and I managed to knock myself off that habit, and I haven't had a drink now in 16 years. But one of the drinks that I used to buy this vodka, it was the cheapest vodka I get at the time, was a vodka called Count Rostov. And so I'm in buying me booze in the off license one day, and the chap behind the counter, we were on first name terms, said to me, "Do you mind if I call you the Count?" And I said, "No, you may not." But who'd have thought years later that word would actually be my pen name for my activities. Now we're just coming up to what I consider is one of the most dangerous bloody roundabouts in Dublin, which is the Walkinstown roundabout, and I'm going to be heading on straight through here. And you should want to see this in the afternoons when it's peak traffic. It's an absolute nightmare. But so that's it really. So I'd like to do after this, I just put a couple of short clips of things that caught my attention, and one of them actually is, believe it or not, to Nelson's Mandela. His grandson was caught carjacking. Imagine that. I just thought, imagine the grandson of a president of a country was caught involved in carjacking and all that. So right, so I suppose I'm going to end it here, and I'd like to again thank my subscribers. I appreciate all those that take the time to comment and share, and I will never be rattling a tin. I will never be asking somebody to buy me a cup of coffee, because that does not interest me. All my videos come from my heart, and it's, as I say, it's my own personal I suppose diary of non-consent. So I'll say good night, good luck, God bless, and God save Ireland from all those who want to do her harm. Coudenhove Kalergi's book Practical Idealism, and I just thought I would go through this was an English translation, 2024, and it says 1925 there, so I just thought I'd scroll through here to give you an idea of the translator, his note on the translation, so you can get an idea of what he was in his mind there. There you go, 1894. So he's quite a character, and it is also believed that in the film Casablanca, the character Victor Laszlo was loosely based on Coudenhove Kalergi, and it's interesting to note that Hitler described him as the cosmopolitan bastard. How about that now? But you can, it's an interesting introduction, even just to give you an idea of what was going on in his thought process. So there you can see his involvement. 1972, at the age of 77, he passed away. There you go, Hitler, cosmopolitan bastard. That's something. But yeah, quite a prolific writer of books. And may not agree with the ideas contained here within. There you go. I certainly don't. But it's worth a read anyway. Curtis White. Here we go. Now this is a video recorded on the 3rd of December 2016, and it gives a list of the amount of people who were taken off the coast of Libya and brought to Italy between October and November. Now the interesting thing about this video was that if you think that with the fall of Gaddafi back in October 2011, when Gaddafi was murdered, one of the things Gaddafi said was that you are bombing the wall that is protecting Europe from being invaded. So how right he was, and it just goes to show how important the removal of Gaddafi was in this scheme to diversify Europe effectively out of existence. And I sent this video to Kevin Myers when he was writing for the Sunday Times, and I got a very nice reply back from him thanking me for the video. However, he said it would be very difficult to be able to prove or charge that these NGOs were involved effectively in human trafficking. But how right he was. Imagine that. And this is 8 years later, 9 years later. Imagine that. I was reading only 2 of 26 Saab Gripen fighters available, and this article is from March of this year. Problems with aviation maintenance long term. Imagine that. So 330 aircraft, only 6 are flyable. And here's a list of the aircraft that are flyable. It's quite extraordinary. It's the Hawk training aircraft that's used by the RAF as well. Red Arrows, you see them flying a lot out of Valley. And you know, you think of the South African Air Force even took part with the UN in Korea in the 1950s, where they flew a mixture of Mustangs and Sabre aircraft with the UN, flew over 12,000 sorties. Imagine that. And compared to now. So maintenance issues, as you can imagine, be a serious issue. Imagine that. And that's of the 330. And this is how they're getting on there with the helicopter fleet. So there's the jets, the Gripen, only 2 flying, 3 Hawk. So effectively is a defenceless country. So the attack helicopters would have been something equivalent to the Apache. The larger ones would be equivalent to the Black Hawk. And B-117 would be similar to the ones that the Garda use. So here you go.
Hans was arrested by the police following a raid on the former president's iconic residence in the upscale Johannesburg suburb of Houghton. The raid, which took place after the police traced a stolen Toyota Corolla to the property, uncovered not only the hijacked vehicle, but also an unlicensed firearm. Along with 4 other individuals, Mabuzo was taken into custody on charges of carjacking and possession of an illegal weapon. Now, he's all set to appear in court on Friday, facing yet another legal battle. Now, this is not the first time that Mabuzo has been in legal trouble. He had previously faced allegations of rape, failure to pay child maintenance and other charges, painting a pretty complicated and controversial picture of a member of South Africa's most famous family. The Mandela's death in 2013 has been the center of family dispute. Nelson Mandela's descendants, including Mabuzo, have firmly opposed proposals to turn the family residence into a museum, stressing that it should remain a private family home rather than a public exhibit. While the house has long been a symbol of family's legacy, its future remains a point of contention.
This is another example of why I hate RTE so much. Ireland's asylum system wide open for abuse, says former military chief. Now, isn't that something the so-called far right or the right so far have been saying about improper checks? And this nonsense about saying that they're not in the Schengen region, that they can't avail of the EU database. Have you ever heard such nonsense? They just don't want to stop them not coming in. And they're not checked for criminal records by fingerprints. Only check for fingerprints if they have registered in another country of origin for asylum. Or they're not checked for infectious diseases. Imagine that. And there's a little video here. Now this might play. Let's see what happens.
New rules on how EU member states process those seeking asylum are due to come into effect next year under the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, which will include new border procedures, faster processing times, and more integrated databases. Now, in a report seen by RTE Radio 1's This Week programme, the government has published its implementation plan of the Pact. Outlined in it, a potential impact that Ireland may not be able to carry out most robust identity validation because of its limited access to the full European search portal. It's led to concerns that Ireland's asylum system is open for exploitation.
Our lack of border control is a security threat to the state, and it needs to be fixed. How? Balancing a little bit more to the security side and look after the genuine people who are fleeing war. There's a lot of people who are not fleeing war and using the system to get into the country. That abuse is actually hurting those who are genuinely looking for asylum.
There's political criticism too, that the government does not have a handle on immigration.
The government haven't a clue what's going on, and so many aspects to this. It took me 2 years of asking the Minister for Justice where were people coming from before she actually found out where people are coming from. We don't necessarily have to opt in to Schengen. The information exists.
In a statement from the Department of Justice, a spokesperson said Ireland has opted into Eurodac, the EU's fingerprint database for asylum seekers, which it says will be upgraded by next year. And it says although Ireland cannot opt in to the Schengen IT systems, the state intends to legislate nationally in order to align with its provisions. Maggie Doyle, RTE News.
I think we've heard enough of that. So there you go. Tobin, ever the opportunist. But he is actually right in this case. Extraordinary, isn't it? And apologies for the start-stop. But you get the idea. And I'd like to watch that programme later on and get more about what that gentleman has to talk about.